Psychological Association made a definitive statement. There is a clear, unequivocal link between violent video games, violent behavior. Their blood pressure goes up, their heart rate goes up, violent actions go up. The data is persistent and clear across many different forms. You cannot deny it. It is overwhelming.
Video games and your kids. 97% of teenagers and preteens say they play them. About a third admit at least one of their favorites is rated mature or adults only, often because of the violent content. Well, a new study finds a link between violent games and aggressive behavior in children.
Of course, America's gun ownership rate used to be a lot higher than it is today. Yet deadly school shootings are mostly a recent phenomenon. What has changed? Could it be our overall culture has undergone a toxic shift? Matt Bevin is the governor of the Commonwealth of Kentucky. He recently suggested that violent video games and TV shows have created a, quote, desensitized culture.
Bad things are happening to young kids and young minds, and their minds are being formed. And we have to do something about maybe what they're seeing and how they're seeing it. And also video games. I'm hearing more and more people say the level of violence on video games is really shaping young people's thoughts.
Hello there everybody in YouTube land, and welcome to the Mr. Sin channel. Today we're taking a break from our traditional format of just looking at a certain topic within a particular class, and instead we're going to be talking about kind of a hot topic issue. We're going to be looking at violent video games, and we're going to be studying, do violent video games actually create real world violence? Are video games impacting the players more than we realize? Now, before you watch this video, I'm going to be talking about a bunch of different sources and things throughout the video. Make sure to check out all my research in the description of the video. Also, don't forget to hit that like button so it kind of helps the YouTube algorithms promote the video and the channel, and consider subscribing if you like it. Now, without further ado, let's get into violent video games and its effect on you. In the past couple of years, the video game industry has been on the rise. In 2018, the video game industry made over $43.4 billion. That's over a 14% increase from 2017. This is according to the NPD Group. It's a group that tracks retail sales of video games. And people have also noted that in the last couple of years, for the United States at least, we've seen a rise in violent crime. So people have come to the question of, do video games equal violence within our communities, in society? Are video games the problem? Now, I want to just quick highlight that when people make the claim that the United States has seen an increase in crime, they're normally talking about the years between 2014 and 2016, where we did see an increase in violent crime. However, as you can see from the chart on the screen provided by the FBI, overall violent crime is down in the United States. However, we do see an increase between years 2014 to 2016. But on the larger scale, overall, again, it is down. We could also look at the nation's homicide rate, and we see similar trends that match the violent crime rate. Now, before we get into all the studies, it's important to understand who are we talking about when we talk about gamers? What are the demographics of people who play video games? Because most of the studies even that I found, they focus on the adolescents. But is gaming really just for kids? According to the Entertainment Software Association, 64% of households own a device that they use to play video games. And the average age of a gamer is actually 34 years old. And over 60% of Americans play video games daily. We can also see the demographics broken down by gender, with women actually playing more games as they get older. And over the years, we can see that women have started to actually make up a larger percentage of the gaming community as a whole. Here you can see that we have the rating breakdowns for video games. Now, this data is from 2017, but we can still get a good look of what type of games are being produced. And at the same time, we can also see a breakdown of what games are actually selling. Here we can see the shooters and action games are the best selling, with sports and role-playing following them shortly behind. So we can see that video games have become pretty popular. In fact, in the last couple of years, sales have spiked, and it's not just kids playing it, it's everyone playing games. Now, some people have made the claim that due to the increase in popularity in video games, we've also seen an increase in violent crime. Now, I wasn't able to find a ton of information that supported this hypothesis. In fact, when researching this and trying to find more information on it to see if it was true or not, I came across an article on the Washington Post that looked at the sale of video games and also violent crime. The article compared video game spending per capita and gun-related murders. It looked at 10 different countries around the world. In fact, we can see when looking at the data that the United States actually has a lot more gun-related murders compared to other countries that were in this study, even though we didn't buy as many video games. In fact, there's kind of an opposite trend. Now, just to be clear, that goes both ways. So this also doesn't show that an increase in video game spending decreases gun-related murders. Remember, correlation does not equal causation. So we would need to have more research to be able to figure out if this is true or not for both sides. Now, this topic is nothing new. People have been claiming that video games have been violent since Death Race came out in 1976. For those of you who don't know, Death Race was a coin-operated game, and the controversy came because it was a driving game that allowed you to run over figures that looked like humans. And when you ran them over, they would screech, and then a little tombstone would pop up, and the player would get a point. Now, by today's standards, this game is laughable at best for violence. Games have completely changed. The graphics have gotten better, the processing power of the systems can do more with the physics, and we can see a lot more animations and actions happening on the screen at a time. However, at that time, the National Safety Council did not think this was something that was laughable. In their quarterly magazine, they described Death Race the game as insidious, morbid, gross, and sick, sick, sick. Gerald Dreisen was one of the people who was very vocal on the game, stating that players no longer were just spectators. He's now an actor in the process. This quote stuck out to me because we still hear this today.
Like Grand Theft Auto.
Yeah, they're
actually-
simulated violence.
It's a criminal simulator, a murder simulator.
Yeah,
All right, let's back it up just a little bit there. But the question is, does he have a point? I mean, if we listen to the media and the daily conversations that are happening in our world today, it seems like video games are one of the main reasons for mass shootings and violent crime and even school shootings. Just a quick side note here, we're only going to be talking about violent video games in this video. We're not going to be getting into school shootings and mass shootings, even though a lot of times video games come up in the conversation. And that's just to give those sensitive topics the respect they deserve. Those should be talked about in their own video. A study from the Molecular Psychiatry looked at the long-term effects of violent video games on players. The study had over 2,000 participants in it, and they were broken up into different groups. First group was a violent group that played Grand Theft Auto 5 for 8 weeks, at least 30 minutes a day. The second was an active control group, which played Sims 3 for the same amount of time as the violent group. And lastly, there was the passive group that played no video games but came in for testing over the 8-week study. To figure out how games were impacting or possibly not impacting players, the study used the following questionnaires. On the screen right now, you can see the 5 different assessment questionnaires that were used to better understand what was happening with the participants throughout this study. They also used behavioral measurements of aggression, such as the world completion task, a lexical task, and a delayed frustration task. The study also looked at the impulsive nature of their participants by using the brief sensation-seeking scale and also the boredom propensity scale. And then on top of that too, they factored in other risk factors and also looked at the emotional empathy and social behavior along with depression and anxiety of the participants in the study. At the end of the study, the violent group that played Grand Theft Auto 5 played on average for 35 hours. And the non-violent group that played The Sims played on average 32 hours. This was over the 8-week period. Participants were tested before the study, during the study, and were contacted 2 months after the study concluded. Now, one of the unique things with this study is participants actually had to go in for testing. This was not self-reported. At the end of the day, this study concluded that there is no significant connection between violent video games and aggression within the player. The study stated that although we used a comprehensive test battery consisting of questionnaires and computerized behavioral tests assessing aggression, impulsivity, related constructs, moods, anxiety, empathy, interpersonal competence, and executive control functions, we did not find relevant negative effects in the response to violent video game playing. In fact, only 3 tests of the 208 statistical tests performed showed a significant interaction pattern that would be in line with this hypothesis. Since at least 10 significant events would be expected by pure chance, we conclude that there were no detrimental effects of violent video gameplay. So far, it's not looking good for the hypothesis that violent video games cause violent actions in the real world. This study was a pretty comprehensive study. You can find the link to the study in the description below. But we aren't done. On my research, I also found other studies that looked at some other things. For example, the next study is from Dartmouth, and they were looking at, do violent video games actually increase risky driving behavior? The Dartmouth study was conducted in 2012, a little bit older than our last study we looked at, which was from 2018. The hypothesis was that the more that people played violent video games, particularly again rated M ones, the more that they would engage in risky driving practices. To assess where participants were playing video games or not, they were called over the phone and asked the following question: how often do your parents allow you to play video games? They were given a 4-point scale to respond. The 4-point scale they were given was never, once in a while, sometimes, and all the time. The participants were also allowed to answer with a 5th option, which was they didn't play video games at all. If they did say that they played video games, then they were asked about 3 specific games. These games were picked because they risked glorifying violence. The study concluded that these were violent games that promoted it. The games were Spider-Man 2, Grand Theft Auto 3, and Manhunt. Now, the study did note that the games varied in violence and glorifying of violence, but still classified them all as violent games. Next, to answer sensation seeking, participants were asked the following items to answer. They were given a 4-point scale to respond. The first one being, I like to do scary things, I like to do dangerous things, I'm often bored, and I like to listen to loud music. The 4-point scale they were given was, would you say it's not like you, a little like you, a lot like you, or just like you? Next, to measure rebelliousness, participants were asked another 4 items. I get in trouble at school, I argue with my peers, I argue with my teachers, I like to break the rules. They were given also then the same 4-point scale as the previous questions. To measure driving, participants were asked the following: whether they had been pulled over by the police, gotten in an accident in the previous year, and if they engaged in any unsafe driving practices. Participants were allowed to answer with a yes or no response. When it came to reckless driving, the study focused on 9 particular actions that they deemed reckless. Lastly, to assess drinking and driving, participants were asked 2 different questions. They were given the situation that they had already consumed over 3 glasses of alcohol, and their friends who were also at the party with them had done the same. They were asked how willing they would be to drive home. They were allowed to answer with not willing, kind of willing, and very willing. The second question they were asked is, how willing were you to get into a car with a friend who would be driving who had also consumed over 3 glasses of alcohol? To test the hypothesis, there was 4 waves conducted. The first wave was wave 0, where participants were asked about video games. Then there was an 8-month interval in between wave 0 and 1, where in wave 1, participants were asked about the personality measures and also the sensation seeking. Wave 2 was separated by a 1.5 years from wave 1, and this is where driving questions and drinking questions started being asked. And then there was a 2-year gap between wave 2 and 3, which also focused on driving and drinking. On the screen right now, you can see the number of participants that were surveyed for each of the 4 waves. You can also see the average age. Remember, this study was focused on adolescents, trying to see the impact that violent video games had on the youth. Participants who reported that they did play video games stated that 32.4% reported that they did play Spider-Man 2, 12.3% played Manhunt, and 57.9% played Grand Theft Auto 3. When looking at the participants' driving habits, the study found that 11.3% of participants admitted to being pulled over by police at Wave 2. And by Wave 3, that percent went up to 21%. For accidents, at Wave 2, 7.8% of participants admitted to being in an accident, while at Wave 3, that percentage went up to 14%. At both Wave 2 and 3, around 1/4 of participants said that they were at least somewhat willing to either drive themselves after consuming more than 3 alcoholic drinks or ride with a friend who drank. And at Wave 2, participants were asked if they would engage in unsafe driving habits. 25.2% of participants responded yes and were asked about 9 specific habits. At Wave 3, 90.4% of participants responded yes to at least one of the 9 risky habits. On the screen right now, you can see the 9 different risky habits as the study identified. You can also see the participants' response rates for each of the 9 different driving habits. At the end of the day, the study concluded that there was a connection between violent video games and also risky driving habits. The study concludes that across multiple waves of data, playing video games was associated with self-reports of risky driving. After controlling for a variety of demographic and prior measures of risky driving, specifically, video game play was associated with reports of automobile accidents, being stopped by police, and a variety of unsafe driving habits, including speeding, tailgating, weaving across traffic, and also crossing over a double yellow line. Now, the last study we're going to go into, I just found recently, and it's from 2019, and it was published from Oxford. Now, this one is being hailed as one of the most comprehensive studies. For time's sake of this video, though, I don't have time to go into all the different procedures that the study used. However, I'll make sure to link everything in the description below. But what the Oxford study found was that there was no connection between violent video game play and violence or aggression in the real world. Currently, the National Center for Health Research in the United States states the following when it comes to aggressive behavior and violent video game play. The American Psychological Association, the APA, considers violent video games a risk factor for aggression. In 2017, the APA Task Force on Violent Media concluded that violent video game exposure was linked to increased aggressive behaviors, thoughts, and emotions, as well as a decrease in empathy. However, it is not clear whether violent video game exposure was linked to criminality or delinquency. Now, they also state too on the site that more research needs to be done when focusing on the criminality and delinquency aspects, saying there's not enough significant evidence yet to show that is going to increase aggressive behavior that would actually cause a crime or a delinquency to occur within society. Lastly, the Center for Health and Research states that at the end of the day, it is important to keep in mind that violent video game exposure is only one risk factor of aggressive behavior. For example, mental illness, adverse environments, and access to guns are all risk factors of aggression and violence. So we can see there's a ton of information that is out there on violent video games and the impact it has on the players and how that then translates into society. And we didn't even get into mass shootings, school shootings, guns, crime rates, and any of those other aspects. This video got long enough just talking about these three main studies and their impacts that they've had on the whole discussion on video games. So the question is this now: do violent video games cause us to become violent? Let me know in the comments below of which study persuaded you more. What do you think? Make sure to hit that subscribe button also on your way out, and don't forget to like the video. I'm Mr. Sin. Thank you so much for watching this video, and until next time, I'll see you online.